I'm thrilled to welcome Matthew back to Trinity Spiritual Center. Last fall, we had a great conversation with Matthew about the prayer of the heart and the practices that were adopted by the desert mothers and fathers, and what we know about those practices impact on our neurological and physical beings from science today. It was a fascinating conversation, one that I've gone back to many times, Matthew. And today he's going to be sharing with us his insight into how we can really see Jesus's life as a series of mystical experiences that we can all benefit from, irrespective of whether or not actually we're, of a Christian tradition or what tradition we follow. He's showing us a path as to how we can more fully participate in the dance that we do with the divine, as the divine continues to unfold in creation. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Matthew's going to share with us some of the insight that he has into a couple great thinkers in this space. One is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who is a geologist, paleontologist, Jesuit priest, who was also a great evolutionary theologian. And then we're also going to explore some of the work of Raymond Panikkar, whom I think I got this right, Matthew. He's a Hindu, Buddhist, Christian. So perfect for the spiritual center. You'll see that as we go along, we'll probably be breaking for questions. So if questions arise, please do feel free to pose them in the chat box. Or Matthew may actually even give us the opportunity to ask the questions directly as we go through this. And we're going to take a pause somewhere in the session to do some contemplative work with Matthew. So for those of you who are coming to this for the first time, not having been through a session with Matthew in the fall, let me just also flag that he is an Episcopal priest in charge at St. Gregory's in Woodstock, New York. He lives with the Benedictine monks at Holy Cross Monastery alongside them. He's a Sufi practitioner, and he has a fabulous wife, Yannick, and a couple cats. And what else do we need to know? I think that's probably about it, Matthew. Welcome. I can't wait to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's so good to be back with the Trinity Spiritual Center, and thank you all of you for pivoting when we were supposed to meet a couple of weeks ago, and it turned out I was sick with COVID that day. I was overwhelmed with fatigue and laid down to take a nap, and then woke up with symptoms, and that's why I was down and out that day. And I'm much improved today. So I'm really grateful that we were able to reschedule and that many of you were able to join us this weekend instead. So as Mark said, we're going to be continuing a conversation we started last year. And this series of conversations is around moving beyond Christianity as merely a belief system, as ideas that we assent to in our heads, and really experiencing it as a path of transformation. And last time we looked at the prayer of the heart as a practice that helps draw the mind, the dualistic mind, into the unitive knowing of the heart. And the heart understood here as an organ of spiritual perception by which we can see from oneness, wholeness, interrelationship. And we looked at Jesus as a master of a path of wisdom and a master of the heart, that he brought a path of transformation that was about awakening and seeing from the heart. And what I want to do in this segment is spend some time with these two ancient Christian doctrines or dogmas of the incarnation and the Trinity, which sometimes are posed as sort of intellectual stumbling blocks to the faith, these things, these weird things that you're supposed to believe in order to be a Christian. And I want to explore them instead as universal mystical experiences that we can enter into, that we can practice. How do we, not how do we believe in the incarnation, but how do we practice incarnation, practice embodying God in our lives? And the Trinity, not again as some weird thing that we believe, but an experience of the dance of love at the heart of the universe that we also can join into. But before we dive into anything, I want to just ground us with a little bit of silence. We'll open with a simple chant. And I invite you just to begin now by taking a moment to settle in and bring awareness to your breath. We begin in the name of God, source of life, who is lover, beloved, and love overflowing, Holy Trinity, holy dance of life in whom we live and move and have our being. And we begin by simply bringing our finest attention to the breath. As we breathe and are breathed by God, by Spirit. And as we worked with last time, if you were with us, we allow some degree of our awareness to drop, to sink from our mental center where we tend to stake our seat of selfhood, to allow our awareness to drop or expand downward into the space of our hearts and into our bodies. Imagining perhaps that we are breathing in and out through our heart. Resting in the warmth and the tenderness of that space of the heart and awakening the qualities of gratitude, of gentleness and mercy, of love. And not simply love for something or gratitude for something, but gratitude as a simple state of being. Love that radiates objectlessly from our hearts. Simple loving awareness. And as you feel moved, you can join your voices to mine and chant. The words are changeless and calm, deep mystery, ever more deeply rooted in thee. Changeless and calm, deep mystery, ever more deeply rooted in thee. Changeless and calm, deep mystery, ever more deeply rooted in thee. Changeless and calm, deep mystery, ever more deeply rooted in thee. Changeless and calm, deep mystery, ever more deeply rooted in thee. And resting in that deep mystery, that we open to through the channel of our open hearts. We pray, Holy One, Holy Oneness, open the eye of our hearts to see you in the faces of all those gathered here in this circle, in this gathering. Open the eye of our hearts to see you in every face and facet of creation. Give us listening hearts as we move through this material, making us open to your deeper promptings, your direction. And let your Holy Spirit, Spirit of life, stir and move among us in this time of gathering as our guest and as our guide through Jesus Christ, our beloved. Amen. And so welcome again, welcome into the circle. And again, it's a joy to be back with all of you. So we'll be exploring, as I said, the Holy Trinity as a mystical doorway, and the incarnation, the embodiment of God, as another mystical doorway. And I want to start looking at what Christians have called the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, and try to break open our idea of what that means and how it might relate to experiences we all know, that we've all had. And some of you may know the great Roman Catholic theologian Karl Rahner. He once joked that the Christian tradition's theology or understanding of the Trinity was so atrophied, so weak, so irrelevant, that if we just quietly phased it out of Christian language altogether, no one would much notice, he said. And this is really because we've developed a lot of bad theology, a lot of really unhelpful theology around what this image points us to. Some of you may know Sandra Schneider's another Roman Catholic theologian and thinker, and she likes to joke that the Trinity is not about two men and a bird. But that's how we've often inherited it, that the Trinity is about two men and a bird, two white men and a bird. And this was brought home for me a few years ago. I was leading a retreat and talking about this subject material, and I looked back at the back wall of the chapel where I was teaching, and the entire wall of the chapel was this beautiful mosaic tile icon of the Trinity. And it was exactly that, two men and a bird. There was God the Father, pictured as an old bearded white man, his head floating above. Then there was Jesus crucified on the cross, hanging in front of him, another white man, which of course Jesus was not. And then flapping above the two of them was a dove, a white bird, two men and a bird. And I thought, oh my, this is the problem. This is why the Trinity doesn't make sense to any of us. And as you probably know, the word Trinity itself, which is in the name of the Spirituality Center, of course, but not in the pages of the New Testament. The word Trinity never shows up in the New Testament. And so it's led some folks to say, well, it's really just a later tacked on belief. Let's just get rid of it. And I think the problem is right there. We think of it as a belief. And what if it isn't a weird thing to believe, though? What if it's actually pointing us to an experience? We don't have to believe anything. We can actually taste and experience something behind this. And the simplest way of looking at this, maybe not where we'll end up. I want to go in a slightly different direction eventually, but one of the most helpful ways I found to think of the Trinity initially is to trace it back to the experience of the first students of Rabbi Yeshua, of Rabbi Jesus, who as participants in the Jewish tradition, that was their home turf, they experienced and knew the holy mystery as transcendent, as God beyond them, as the creative source of all life. And so they had an experience of God as transcendent source and creator. But then, here in this wild rabbi and Jesus, they came to have an experience of the holy, of the divine, in a human life. This experience of God in the human other. And then, little by, and we should say the Christian tradition, we've often said, well, and that's just in Jesus. The experience of God in human life then gets boxed in Jesus. But of course, even in the New Testament, the understanding is that this experience of the Christ goes on unfolding through the body of Christ, through the whole community. And we experience also in each other the experience of God in the human face. And so this experience of God here among us, God beyond us, now God among us. And then at Pentecost, if you're familiar with the church year, Pentecost is the time after Jesus has died. He's appeared in this mysterious way to the disciples, and then he leaves them a final time, his ascension. And he says, it's good that I go away. If I don't go away, the Holy Spirit can't come to you. This sense that the outer teacher, the form of the teacher that we want to cling to, we have to let that go if we're to discover the inner teacher, the teacher within ourselves. And if you remember the story of Mary Magdalene on Easter Sunday, she appears at the tomb and she sees the risen one, sees Jesus in his subtle body, and she wants to grab onto him. And he says, "Do not cling to me." And of course, that's what we want to do. We want to cling to what we've known, what's familiar, what has comforted us. And he says, do not cling to me. It is good that I go away. And so there's this sense of something new opens when we can release that outer form. Something can arise within ourselves. And so this is the experience of Pentecost. The disciples are gathered in prayer for 10 days. And on the 10th day, it says in the text that the Spirit charged through the room like a rushing wind. And they looked around and saw tongues of fire resting on each other's heads. And they felt the Spirit poured into their own being like fire in their own hearts. And they had a profound experience of God, no longer simply beyond them or God beside them, among them, but now God within them. The God who is our own deepest self, who energizes us and charges us and sends us out into the world. And so if we stop right there with those three basic experiences, the experience of God who is beyond, the experience of God who is among and with us, and then the experience of God who is profoundly within us, that is a pretty amazing angle onto the Trinity. This isn't two men and a bird. This is experiences that we can ground truth in our own daily life. Have we ever had an experience of transcendent mystery that just opens into the moreness beyond God, holy mystery beyond us? Have you ever had the experience of God among us in a human face, maybe in a non-human face, in the face of an animal friend, or in the face of creation itself, the experience of God incarnate in the world? And then, of course, in those deepest moments of prayer, we can experience God within us as our own deepest self. And so we have what we could say is the transcendent experience. This is the incarnate experience, God in flesh, embodied in the world. And then this is the immanent experience, God immanent within our own depths. So beyond, among, within, transcendent, incarnate, and immanent. So we could stop right there, and we've broken the Trinity out of abstraction or two men and a bird into experience. But this is where Ramon Panikkar comes in. So he says that we can take this even further. This opens us to the different ways that we can relate to and experience the divine, and it traces the experience to the experience of the disciples of Jesus. But what Panikkar said is that we can actually trace this to the heart mind of Christ himself. That this experience is first, the outlines, the lineaments of this are laid out in the teaching of Jesus within the Gospels. And if you don't know Ramon Panikkar, as Mark said, he was an expansive spirit. He was born to a Roman Catholic Spanish mother and to an Indian Hindu father. And so he had interreligious dialogue in his DNA from the get-go. And as a young man, he had an awakening that led him to the priesthood, called to the priesthood, and he was ordained in the Roman Catholic Church. But then, little by little, the longing to explore the other half of his spiritual lineage drew him to India. And so he went to India, and he would say many years later that he left Europe a Christian. In India, he discovered himself a Hindu, and he returned home finally a Buddhist, without ever having ceased to be a Christian. And so he found those three strands were like strands in a triple helix spiraling within his being, and that there was no competition or conflict between those traditions, that they could integrate themselves within his own life. As a tangent, it reminds me, I know many of us are grieving the death of Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed beyond the veil this past Friday. This great Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk and peace activist who's left such an indelible impact on the life of the planet, the spiritual life of this planet and of the human family. And Thich Nhat Hanh liked to tell the story of going to one of the very early Buddhist Christian dialogue conferences when contemplatives, monastics of these true traditions were brought together. And he said that there was at the beginning of the conference, a Roman Catholic bishop who stood up and said, "It's all very well and good for us to engage in interfaith dialogue. Yes, this is important, but let's remember that we're not here to make a fruit salad." In other words, don't mix and match and blur the lines, folks. You know, stay within the proper boundaries. And Thich Nhat Hanh stood up and responded, "But why not? Fruit salad can be delicious." Fruit salad can be delicious. And I love that spirit of deep ecumenism that he embodied. So Ramon Panikkar was a kindred spirit in that sense. And so what he did, he said, well, let's look at the way Jesus talks about the divine human experience within the pages of the Gospels. What are the facets of the experience he had of the Holy Mystery? So I've written some verses on a page here for us to look at. And these all come from John's Gospel. And in the text, it actually says, the Father is greater than I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. I and the Father are one. And I've taken the liberty of gender neutralizing Jesus' first century patriarchal language here. Of course, Jesus' word for God was in fact Abba, which is a term of tender intimacy, that intimacy between a parent and a child. And I think for Jesus, the importance wasn't on the gendered nature of the language, it was on that intimate nature of the language. So I've substituted God in these sayings. So Panikkar said, let's look at some of the ways Jesus talks about how he experienced God. So there's this experience of God is greater than I. This is, again, that experience of the transcendent, the mystery beyond. But he also says things like this: I am in God and God is in me. There's a quality of intimacy that enters the picture here, less hierarchical. And then there's this deep mystical utterance: I and God are one. Now, these three sayings, we've often in the Christian tradition installed a glass ceiling either at this level or at this level. And we say, Jesus can say those things, and we can look at him adoringly as he says them, but we're not allowed to say those things. In our extremely reformed traditions that believe in the utter depravity of humanity, we often draw the line right here. All the rest of us, we can say God is greater than I, and that's all that we get to say. Now, in our more sacramental, Eucharistic traditions, we'll usually allow people to say, I am in God and God is in me. There's a sense of the indwelling, the interabiding. But even then, most of us have drawn a line here. When Jesus says, I and God are one, we say, hold on, that's just for him. Only he gets to say that. But in the process of saying that, we actually negate Jesus' own teaching in John's Gospel. Because what does he go on to say? He goes on to pray on the night before he dies, may they all be one as you and I are one. He prays that all of humanity would enter into this experience of divine human unity as he lived and experienced it. And so we see Jesus inviting us all into these same depths. So what I want to do right now, I want to invite you all to either type in the chat or unmute yourself and call out we're going to do a little word association here. So we're going to take these one at a time. With God is greater than I, if that was the only relationship you had access to with the divine, God is greater than I, what kind of relationship would that open for you? What words come to mind in relation to God is greater than I, positive or negative? Feel free to unmute. Admiration. Admiration is one of the words. So we are admiring, we are adoring God. What other words? Authority is one of the words. A sense of God is the ultimate authority. Awe, a great word, a sense of awe at the mystery of the God who is greater than I. Praise, someone said. Unattainable, someone said. Power, someone else said. Power, praise kind of goes with awe. Unattainable, unattainable. On the other side of this, we might say something like fear, right? fear could be a negative side of this. And there's certainly a sense of hierarchy. And what other qualities does it open? Humbled, someone said. Subservient, someone said. So humility is a beautiful quality that this could awaken. Humility. And on the slightly more negative side, perhaps subservience. So these are great words that capture the full range of this, from fear and awe to humility and admiration to praise. So this facet of the mystery opens to all of that. But let's move to this next one. Let's say that this is all we have. We only have, I am in God and God is in me. What facets of the mystery does that open? What qualities does that cultivate as you think about that relationship? Oh, and you weren't able to unmute yourselves. Now you can if you would like to. I've just allowed it. Let's see if there are others. Brotherhood, great. So a sense of community, brotherhood. Presence.
I am potentially as good as the Christ.
I am potentially as good as the Christ. And other words here are mutuality, connection, and deep intimacy. Intimacy.
Huge responsibility.
Mutuality and huge responsibility. Responsibility.
Innate goodness.
Goodness, innate goodness. Wonderful. So we've got some beautiful words here that have come in. Brotherhood, community, presence, mutuality, goodness, intimacy. So the temperature in the room has shifted here. This is this parental God who's up and out there. This is an intimate God. We're actually almost moving into the realm of sexual metaphor here. I am in God. God is in me. This is a very intimate relationship that moves into the train of lover and beloved. It's no longer parent and child. It's now lover and beloved. It's a relationship between equals who are in an exchange together. I am in God and God is in me. We might even say co-creation might come in here. So now let's move to this third rung. I and God are one. What associations does that bring up? Union, Jim said, union. Abiding. That's one of Jesus' favorite words in the Gospel of John. Abide in me, flow.
Boundaryless.
Boundaryless. Beautiful. No boundaries. What was that, Cecily? I didn't hear you.
Total accessibility.
Total accessibility. Total accessibility.
Trying to unmute. Endlessly creative.
Endlessly creative. Endlessly. Beautiful.
Yeah, timelessness.
What's that one?
Timelessness.
Timelessness. Beautiful. Timelessness. Great. So these are amazing words that are coming up here. Abiding, boundaryless. Yes.
Not confined to time or space.
Not confined to time or
Non-local.
space. Non-local. Great. Non-local. So this is a different relationship again entirely as well. So we've moved from hierarchy to mutuality to total unity, union, flow, endlessly creative. And I think we might also put responsibility. Someone mentioned it here. We might put this here too. Oh, shoot. If I and God are one, that's a big responsibility. I better take this seriously. So what Ramon Panikkar said is that each of these facets of the divine human experience that Jesus lived are available and accessible to all of us. None of these are for Jesus alone. They're all for all of us to experience. But what he says that I think is crucial here, we might tend to think of this with our Western linear minds as a ladder. We might say, oh, this is the low rung of kindergarten spirituality where I think God is greater than me. And this is adolescent spirituality where I think I'm in God and God is in me. And this is grown-up spirituality where I know I and God are one. But Panikkar says, hold on a minute. This isn't a ladder, it's a circle. The Trinity is a circle, is a dance. And he says, these aren't things we move through in a linear order. These are the facets of the divine human relationship that we move through, not just over the course of a life, but through the course of a day, or even in the course of a single period of prayer. That there are moments where we need nothing more but to cry out to the God who is greater than me, than my little ego. There are moments where we need the relationship of lover and beloved. And then there are moments in pure silence where we just want to be the drop returning to the ocean, back into that total ocean of unity. And he says it's all of these all the time. It's not one or the other in a hierarchy, that we dance through all of them, and that to have a balanced spiritual life, we in fact need to cultivate all of them. That any one of these on its own can lead to an imbalance. So let's imagine that someone goes out and has a deep unitive experience, but they actually haven't done a lot of work purifying their ego, and suddenly now they're running around with an inflated ego saying, I am God. Well, that's a problem. So what's the medicine for that? God is greater than I. But if we only have God is greater than I, we could devolve into fear-based, legalistic, hierarchical religion. So what's the medicine for that? I'm in God and God is in me. And so he says, when we keep these in motion, we keep dancing through them all, our spirituality stays whole and balanced and human in a way that it isn't when we have just one or the other. So Panikkar believed that the intuition in Jesus' experiences here actually lies at the heart of what we've come to call the mystery of the Holy Trinity. That Jesus' experience was this staggering leap beyond traditional monotheism. Traditional monotheism believing that there is an eternal divide between the creator and the created. That we're sort of eternally separate. It's that God kind of out there in a more deistic model. But for Jesus, it wasn't deism, where it's just the God out there, but it also wasn't pantheism, where it's just we're all one cosmic soup of unity. It was, in fact, an inter-abiding, dynamic, non-dual experience that kept all of these as authentic, valid, and real all at the same time. So you can't collapse any one into the other. You keep them all in motion. So this is the vision of what non-dual thinkers call not one, not two, both one and two, all at the same time. And Panikkar thought that this was the Trinitarian mandala. And he said that the Trinity isn't a God out there. The Trinity is, in fact, the deep triadic structure of reality itself. And he said that this invites us to enter into dialogue with other faith traditions as people coming from a Christian background in a way that actually can build profound bridges. So we've often thought of the Trinity as a club that we beat other religions up with. You know, Christians will say, oh, it's great that Jews and Muslims are monotheists, but we know that God's really a Trinity. And then it becomes a game of one-upmanship. Why my religion's better than yours? And Panikkar says, no, cut that out. Cut that out. And so he talks about what he liked to call finding homeomorphic equivalencies, which is a big word for finding places of experiential resonance between our traditions rather than dogmatic formulas that are comparable. So he said, you can go to your Muslim neighbor and say, well, where's the Trinity in your religion? And they'll go, oh, we don't have that. And now there's no point of connection. But you could instead go to your Muslim neighbor and say, where is your experience of God beyond you? Where is your experience in your tradition of God among us? Where is your experience in your tradition of God within you? And now you're talking. Different traditions can talk about that at the level of experience. Now we then formulate it out in ways that seem to be at loggerheads. But if we can step behind the formulas to the experiences, really authentic dialogue can begin to happen. So that was his hope. And he saw that each of these different religious traditions in the world have angled in on these in different ways and to different degrees. In the West, in the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, we've mostly focused on the transcendence of God. Even Christians, even though we talk about God incarnate, by and large, we focused on the transcendent God. Now, we might say that indigenous and earth-based and shamanic traditions have really had a sense of God in creation, God in the world, God in us and us in God. And the non-dual traditions of the East, let's say Advaita Vedanta, Zen Buddhism, some of these very non-dual unitive traditions have understood this truth of God profoundly well. And what this understanding of the Trinity says is, hey, we're all right. Everyone's right. Everyone is angling onto one facet of the holy mystery, and no one's wrong. This is all part of one big vision that's actually coherent, that actually holds together. Here's a quotation from Pentecost about the Trinity. And it's very verbose, as he often was, but he says, the whole of reality could be called, in Christian language, Father, Christ, Holy Spirit. The font of reality, the font, the wellspring, the font of reality, reality in its act of being, that is, its becoming, the existing reality, which is the whole Christ, not yet fully realized. So he's saying that there's the ground of being, and then there's the world of becoming. And he says the world of becoming is the unfolding Christ. And then finally he says, and the spirit, the wind, the divine energy that maintains the perichoresis, or the circle dance, in movement. So he sees the Trinity as the dance from the unmanifest ground of all being, the Father, through the dance of manifestation, the Son, and in the Spirit who unites the whole thing in movement. So it's a beautiful vision, and it knocks us out of playing that religious one-upmanship that has plagued so much of Christian and Abrahamic traditions often, but particularly the Christian tradition. Another way this can be understood when we say that the Trinity is both one and three, is three in one and one in three, and I think this is crucial, is to understand that we are not talking about the numeric one or the numeric three. The numerical one is a number in a sequence of numbers that falls between 0 and 2. When we say God is one, we're not talking about the numerical one. We're talking about oneness, the oneness that holds all of the numbers, not one that falls in a sequence of numbers. And similarly, when we say God is three, I think that this isn't the numerical 3 that falls between 2 and 4. 3 instead points to manyness, movement, dynamism. And so when we say God is 1 and 3, we're saying God is oneness and manyness. God is stillness and movement. God is silence and sound. That's at the heart of the Trinitarian mandala, 1 and 3 and 3 and 1. So I find this a really hopeful vision of what the Trinity might open as for us, that takes us leaps beyond 2 men and a bird, that roots us back in our own experience, and that allows us to dialogue in a really productive way with other traditions. I want to read one more quotation, and then we'll take a moment of silence, and then we'll see if there are any reflections on this image before we move to the mystery of the Incarnation, to round out our time together. But this quotation comes from an Anglican monk, H.A. Williams, who was a monk in the Community of the Resurrection in the United Kingdom, in the UK, one of the Anglican monasteries there. And he's writing about these two phrases, that God is greater than I and God are one. He writes, let's take a moment just to listen with the ear of our heart. I and the Father are one. The Father is greater than I. I believe those two sentences to be true of us all. And I believe that to a unique degree, Jesus revealed to us this truth about ourselves. The trouble is, of course, that to a greater or less extent, we don't believe it. We refuse to realize it. We remain blind and deaf to it because we are too busy, which generally means too frightened, to go down deep within ourselves and find God there. It is my failure, thus, to assimilate the truth that I and the Father are one, which fixates me on a superficial level of myself and drives me to protect that superficial self by tooth and claw. All evil springs from my refusal to discover who and what I truly am, my failure to realize that I and the Father are one. It is my failure to assimilate the truth that I and the Father are one, which fixates me on a superficial level of myself and drives me to protect that superficial self, that ego self, by tooth and claw. All evil springs from my refusal to discover who and what I truly am, my failure to realize that I and the Father are one. So I want to invite you in the short silence that follows to enter into your own experience of each of these three faces of God. The word in Greek that we translate as the three persons of God, hypostases, comes from the same Greek word for mask, the mask that an actor in a Greek drama would wear. And so we can understand these three persons of God as the three eternal faces, the three eternal facets of the holy mystery as it meets us and unfolds in and through us in the world. And so take a moment to lean into your own sense of God beyond us, of that transcendent mystery that opens you to awe, that cultivates humility and wonder, perhaps felt standing beneath the night sky filled with stars. How have you known the truth of God is greater than I, of the God beyond? And then lean in yourself into the experience of God among us, God incarnate, God in the lines and wrinkles of a beloved human face. God incarnate in the cat purring in your lap, or in the tree that gives you shade. God here incarnate with and among us. How have you known this face of the mystery? And then finally, the experience of God within us as us. God is our own deepest self. As the fire shut up in our bones, as the life animating our life, as the heart of our heart. How have you known God as God within you? And resting in that holy mystery, as you feel moved, I welcome you to share any questions in the chat, or simply to unmute yourself if there's a reflection or a question arising. How does this vision of the Trinity excite you, confuse you, give you hope, challenge you? Feel free to unmute and share, or to type any questions into the chat box. Or you can also simply rest a bit longer in the Holy Mystery. Yes, Cecily.
I think I'm unmuted. I'm not sure. Am I?
You are, yeah.
Okay, it said mute. Well, I want to say thank you, because for me, this is so complete. It just fills my heart. It's so complete. It's every way that I experience God. And so it feels like, wow, on that one page, how did he do that? That is so amazing. So I don't know that I have any questions. It's just gratitude that I feel. I will say that I am someone who's had a number of non-local experiences. So I added that because I feel as though, as you read, that we limit ourselves in many ways. And one is the perception that we believe our senses, and that we are confined here in this body. And my experience in life is that is not true. Not a bad home, but it's not, it's not all there is.
Not the whole picture. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
He says that Marianne Williamson says, it's not that we're so frightened of being powerless. It is that we are frightened of the power we have. God is abiding in us. What does that mean in terms of our power to manifest? In partnership with God, our abilities to manifest are simply extraordinary.
Thank you. Beautiful. Yeah. Any other reflections or sharings or questions?
Matthew, this is
Yes,
Harold
Harold.
Schmitz. Thanks very much for all that you've reviewed. We've been doing some of this in anticipation of your work on Sunday nights in the Trinity Meditation Room, and looked at this concept of Trinity incarnation. And you've covered it beautifully and quite simply and directly. And it all points for us to this whole notion of relationship, with the relationship of God above, with the relationship of God in all of the rest of creation, the rock to the sun, and whatever it is, to the whole celestial, multiverse. And of course, to that relationship within ourselves. So I love to look upon the Trinity as, a relationship God, that this God is always present in every one of our relationships. And there are exercises we do. So I just want you to know we're going to be taking what you've outlined tonight in our future sessions on Sunday night. I want to thank you for this delightful presentation and an inspiriting one. I like to summarize all of this with the following: in every dyad is a triad. You can't have a two without a three. And that, for me, is the simplest explanation of the Trinity, but you have given others. It's not this doctrine. It's real, and we live it, whether we're Buddhist or Christian or agnostic or atheist. It's just part of being human. So thanks again.
Thank you, Harold. Yeah, beautifully expressed. Any other thought before we shift to the incarnation mystery? Yeah, Mark.
I was just going to say, I haven't quite worked this out in my head, and maybe this isn't the time to have this thought, but I was trying to bring the dance of the Trinity back into relationship with the last conversation that we had, in which we were looking at the cross as the sort of the one axis of the eternal here and now, and then the other axis through the sort of time and space, and how God is present across all dimensions here and now, and what the dance looks like in the moment.
Beautiful. Yeah, very beautiful. Thank you for weaving that in. And yes, we explored last time the vertical axis of our being, which opens to the eternal, and the horizontal axis of our being, our life unfolding through time. And that when you map those as the two arms of the cross, the point of intersection is the space of the heart. And the heart is where time and eternity meet, where heaven and earth meet. And it would be fun to map the triad over that and see what that says about those relationships. And of course, there's God beyond, God in community, and God in self. Those three relationships. And let's all just keep playing with how the relationships play out. But it's certainly, the Trinity points to this idea that reality is a web of interrelationship, that reality is interrelational, and that we live in a web of tender intimacy. We are held in relationship. Relationship is the nature of reality. And to go back to our beloved Thich Nhat Hanh, who just died, he spoke about this in terms of interbeing. He said, none of us simply bees, we interbe, that there is no being without interbeing. Buddhists, of course, would call this interdependent co-arising, that everything arises in the manifest world in relationship to everything else. And our modern ecological awareness tells us this, that our ecological systems are interdependent wholes, that life is a web, and if you tug one strand, the whole web moves. And quantum physics tells us this, that we live in a relational field, and that quantum entanglement, right? Everything, as we move down into the mystery of things, everything is actually deeply interwoven. Jesus beautifully expresses this. We'll look at this when we have our gathering on the luminous Gospels. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Jesus beautifully teaches this wonderful 2nd century Christian text that all of life, he says, all of nature with its forms and creatures exists together and are interwoven with each other. So this is an ancient vision. If you were in a liturgical congregation this morning, this was one of the lectionary readings, Paul's vision of the one body with many members that form a single body, that everything exists in relationship. And the Trinity points us to that as well.